Hello everyone. Ever wondered how you could get into a possibly toxic polycule with your table full of MTG playing friends? Well, I'm here to explain how to do just that. However, let me introduce myself first. My name is Ren, also known as DevilCat3D, and I'd like to say welcome to the channel. Seeing as this is my first MTG video on the channel, I'd like to start by saying I am an avid Magic the Gathering fan, and have been into the game since around original Innistrad block. I've been playing Commander for a few years at this point. It is definitely my current favorite format, and I don't see that changing anytime soon. This video will be all about my favorite deck I've ever built in all my time playing Magic. That may not sound like much of a feat, but ever since getting into Commander a few years ago, I have accumulated nearly 200 playable EDH decks on my Architect page. And yet this one reigns at the top for me for one major reason, and that's because it's unique. Its main gimmick is quite charming if I do say so myself. So without further ado, here's your guide to marrying your EDH playgroup. How to live forever together in holy matrimony. That may sound like a lofty goal, but I promise, it's easier than it sounds. This deck is built around the concept of casting a wedding ring and copying its triggered ability 2+ times to give every single player a copy, or multiple copies, of wedding ring, thus allowing you all to share in the wonder and joys of love, also known as free cards and life gain. You may be asking yourself, how do you accomplish this? Doesn't wedding ring only target one opponent on cast? How do I copy it? Well, dear viewer, it's pretty simple. The way we copy its ability is when it enters the battlefield. We set up ahead of time cards that allow us to copy ETB effects, such as Panharmonicon and Elish Norn, Mother of Machines, to copy its ETB ability one time per each instance of an ability doubler. This means that to give a whole table of 4 players one copy of Wedding Ring, we need to have at least 2 copies of these types of cards on the battlefield for this plan to work. Luckily for us, this deck is led by one of them in the command zone. His name is Gandalf the White, and he loves officiating at polyamorous weddings. There's also a couple other cards that can copy the Wedding Ring ETB, such as Strionic Resonator and Lithoform Engine on their 2-mana modes, but those are definitely less strong since you'd need more mana to activate them. But we are running every way in mono white to copy abilities for this single purpose. Once we have a wedding ring on every player, the game doesn't really feel like Magic anymore, since 3 players will draw a card every time the active player draws a card, and same with life gain, which means the game has a tendency to either go really fast or really slow depending on how well everyone takes advantage of this free card draw. But we do have a few ways to take advantage of this fact. For example, there are some combos in the deck that rely on your opponents drawing cards when you draw cards. Notably, if you have a Smothering Tithe out, every time you draw a card with Wedding Ring out, your opponents each draw a card, and this means unless they pay 2 mana, you get a treasure token. This equates very often to making 3 treasures every card drawn, which when you throw in something like Mind's Eye, makes enough mana to draw a card every time your opponents draw a card, meaning that you have essentially built infinite card draw and mana until you all mill out. This may sound convoluted, but it's extremely fun, and you get to be in love while you do it, so what's the harm? Notably, unless you have more cards in your library than all of your opponents, this doesn't win automatically. But if you can get multiple wedding rings on your opponents, then this can lead to them drawing enough cards to mill out long before you do, which is possible with our many doublers. An important recent addition to the deck comes in the form of Credit Voucher, an artifact that sacrifices to shuffle my hand into my library and draw that many cards. This, with a wedding ring, nets me 0 additional cards drawn, but draws my opponents equal to the number of cards in my hand. And since it's an artifact, it is easily recurable and tutorable in this deck, which means it can very easily draw your opponents out with a decent amount of mana. The deck runs a few tutors to make this happen, but white is notable for having a lack of good tutors that can get a card into your hand, so we're running some bad cards like Ring of 3 Wishes and Skyship Weatherlight to find our many pieces, since we need the wedding ring in hand due to it being a cast trigger. Now, this deck plays like a little guy a lot of the time and isn't often seen as a threat early, but once you start drawing a large portion of your deck or marry everybody or start getting more than one Panharmonicon effect on the field, people tend to get very scared. So be prepared to take table aggro when you start really popping off. This is why we run several protective pieces in this deck such as Lightning Greaves, Clever Concealment, and Dawn's Truce. Another fun little gimmick of this deck is that people really like seeing you marry the whole table. Oftentimes, I've had games where we consider it a win for the polyamory player regardless of the actual outcome of the game, purely based off whether they can successfully marry the whole table or not, and it makes the game feel a lot more chill and takes a potentially very competitive format like Commander and makes it seem more casual. That's not to say that this deck can't be cutthroat or that people will take it easy on you, but having an extra objective in a Magic game really gives you an excuse to just have fun with the game and not take it as seriously if you want to. There are also some more combos which I will discuss here, however keep in mind that I haven't played the new version of the deck enough to find every instance of a combo yet, so there's probably more hiding in there, and some of these are untested. But since we are running Lithoform Engine in this deck, we are also running Sands of Time to make infinite mana. This combo works by tapping all of your lands on your upkeep for mana, which in turn will result in Sands of Time untapping all of your lands. This can make infinite mana by copying the triggered ability with Lithoform Engine, which makes the engine tapped so that Sands will untap it with your lands, which lets you repeat the process. This deck has a couple of ways to utilize this infinite mana, one of which is Sky Crier. This little birdie can pay 4 to draw you and an opponent a card, which with a Wedding Ring will draw your opponent out faster than you so you can forcibly mill out your dearly beloved. It's also infinite card draw without a Wedding Ring though, of course. Also, we have Ancestral Statue with Altar of the Brood to mill out your opponents, which notably can happen on your upkeep since Gandalf gives your artifacts, aka Statue Flash. This one is less polyamory focused, but my table is pretty combo heavy, so it felt necessary to add to the deck. Speaking of necessary, this deck also runs a piece of Storm Hate and Rug of Smothering, sometimes also Spelltithe Enforcer, to combat my silly girlfriend's storm-based deck building habits. So if that doesn't appeal to you or fit your table, that is an easy cut in this deck. Now obviously, we can't always win with a combo since RNG is the nature of the game. So other than combos, this deck plays like an artifact and legendary creature ETB deck since Gandalf cares about these pieces, and the deck can win very fairly from being a blink and artifact heavy deck. We have lots of card draw to enable drawing out our opponents through Wedding Ring Polyamory, but can also win fairly with a big board and a Moonshaker Cavalry. This deck feels like it gets new pieces every set and also is just far from being perfect due to the nature of the archetype, so if you feel like you can do better, I recommend trying building this deck yourself or playing my deck as well. I'll leave a link in the description for all of you in case you feel like you could use some more love at your EDH tables. There are some cards I have chosen not to run for power level reasons like Farewell because my girlfriend hates it, or Eldrazi Displacer because it felt incredibly mean and control-y, and also Trouble in Pairs, which is obviously one of White's best card draw pieces, but I don't like the card and it felt difficult to stick for 4 mana. You can definitely add them if you don't mind the feel-bads that can arise from them, but I chose to leave them out for the sake of my table's enjoyment. This deck also feels like it has a million possible iterations with just the sheer amount of cards that work in an ETB mono white deck. So I obviously can't add every card, and I thought I'd add a section about the cards I chose to leave out for other less obvious reasons. The most interesting ones would be Psychosis Crawler, which seemingly would be perfect in a deck that tries to win through drawing lots of cards, but frankly I just don't like the card. It feels too expensive to just drop on the table and expect it to live till your pop-off turn, and I've seen it win enough times in my friend's Quain deck, so I chose not to add it. There's also other cards that are good in something like Elish Norn, Mother of Machines, but feel worse here, like Skyclave Apparition. Things that have a generally good ETB effect are definitely good in this deck, but are less consistent if you don't get one of the 4 non-Gandalf Panharmonicons on the field, since they are not artifacts or legendaries, so I chose to only add the cards that work with Gandalf to make the deck more thematic and consistent. Obviously, if you build this deck, you could swap the commander for something a little less niche, but Gandalf is my favorite ETB doubling boy, and I will not betray him for a sometimes better but less flashy commander. Also, on a side note entirely unrelated from the rest of the video, if you are a gay furry like I am, there's one little optional piece of tech I think you will appreciate. It's a card known as Jinxed Choker, and it essentially lets you add pet play to Magic the Gathering. Full disclosure, it's very bad and isn't a good card to run in a normal build of this deck. But it was in the very first iteration of the deck, and if you were playing the deck for the fun of marrying all of your bestest friends, then this is a great little power dynamic to add to your casual games by passing around the dog collar. This deck also has a major downside when it comes to the main marry all your friends into a polycule game plan, and that is it's very easy to destroy and or sacrifice artifacts in your average commander game. I like to refer to someone blowing up a copy of Wedding Ring as getting a divorce, and trust me, it feels so bad. For starters, if they blow up your copy and they all have one, you have essentially been kicked out of the relationship, meaning all your opponents are now drawing extra cards and gaining life, which can put you at a serious disadvantage. There's also the threat that you give a Wedding Ring to a sacrifice deck, and they get rid of it to draw cards or grow their commander, and that does lead to the potential that you can't win through making your enemies love you, such as with my girlfriend's ever popular Flame War Brash Veteran deck or something like Corvold. Which is sad, but also it's just part of the problem with forcing a marriage on 3 other people. Sometimes you just want different things. It's not you, it's me, they might say. Notably, the deck does have some ways to recur Wedding Ring if the actual copy ends up in the graveyard or exile, in Karn the Great Creator and Mistveil Plains, which can make the win accessible again with a quick tutor or recasting the ring. Just keep in mind this is not a foolproof strategy and it has a fail rate. But what's a few divorces under your belt? Someone will love you someday, I promise. Now, obviously there are more ways to build this deck than just the one I went with. The most clear path you could take to make this concept your own is changing the commander. And Mono White has another really good option that happens to also be in the deck in Elish Norn, Mother of Machines. She is very strong and would make a very good commander for a more generic ETB blank deck, but she also tends to shut off enough of your opponent's cards that she takes a lot of heat from the table. She is very likely to die and would probably require more protection to make good, whereas Gandalf is only seen as a threat by a table who is experienced with his shenanigans or has played against a few artifact decks in their time. Otherwise, Mono White is not the only option for making this deck powerful. I have personally experimented with adding other colors to the deck to great success. Blue is easily the best second color for the deck, giving you some insane card draw options as well as even more artifact synergies. The strongest card I can think of in a build with blue is Enter the Infinite, which with a Wedding Ring on both of your opponents tends to just draw them out then and there. I once managed to get a ring on both of my opponents and managed to cast an Enter the Infinite off of the 7th Doctor, who was the commander of one of the early alternate variants of the Polyamory archetype I built, which won me the game on the spot. My girlfriend was experimenting with a variant of this deck that jumps into the Esper colors and uses Sidri Galvanic Genius as its commander, which is a deck I'm very intrigued by. The main idea of this deck that sets it apart from Gandalf is the idea of turning your copy of Wedding Ring into a creature with Sidri, which lets you bounce it back to hand to allow you to recast it. This bypasses the need for ability doublers and allows you to cast Wedding Ring to get more copies on your opponents instead. This deck is so far unfinished, but has lots of promise as the addition of 2 more colors really opens the deck up and would give the deck a more generic niche than what it has now. But this just goes to show how diverse this concept can get when you get creative with it. I'll probably stick with Gandalf as my main go-to for a long while, but I encourage you to try your own little twist on the concept if you ever get the chance. Now, this deck is not perfect and could probably be improved for specific metagames and different tables, but the core identity is very important to me, so I try to keep the deck similar to the deck I built originally. This includes some pet cards like Ariet's Tempting Apple and Canoptic Scarab Swarm, which are still good cards, but also it has less lands and removal than I might like, with me needing to squeeze in so many cards for the core strategy. And also just lots of cards that I like, so there's lots that you can change to adapt the strategy to your liking. Otherwise, the main thing that changed when building new versions of this deck is namely that I got better at building Magic decks. I used to not be very good at it, believe it or not, and I still feel like I have work to do since deck building is a skill. But also, like I've stated previously, this deck never stops getting new good cards. I always look forward to new sets because they give me so many fun and new options for my favorite pile of cardboard. And frankly, I'm excited to keep innovating in the field of forming polycules out of unsuspecting EDH tables with Gandalf the White Polyamory, which was not always the only name it had. Here's all the previous titles of past iterations in case you were curious. If you build your own version, I highly encourage you to show it to me and name it something cute and or funny just to keep the tradition alive. Anyway, that brings us to the end of the video. I hope you can play with the deck and have fun dating your whole table. Get out there and marry your friends. Start a polycule in Mono White and enjoy living in a world where only love and peace exist. At least for a few turns of the game before you brutally destroy your opponents with a loving blast of card draw fueled mill, that is. Well, that's all for me. My name is Ren, aka Devilcat3D, and thank you for watching. Bye bye!